The night began with a secret that no one was ever supposed to know. Beneath the glittering skyline of Manhattan, hidden behind tinted glass windows and private meetings, a deal was being struck that was darker than any business contract. She was just a girl born into poverty, her life a collection of unpaid bills and endless sacrifices. Yet tonight, her innocence was no longer hers. Tonight, she sold it, not to save herself, but to save her dying mother, to cover debts that threatened to bury her entire family. And the man who bought her purity was not just anyone. He was the ruthless enemy her family had warned her about for years, a man whose empire was built on broken promises, shattered rivals, and iron control. A man who was whispered about in hushed tones at law firms, at universities, at Wall Street cocktail parties. A man who never lost. The first time she saw him, her breath caught, not because of his beauty, though he was beautiful in the most lethal way, but because of the aura that surrounded him. Power. Absolute, unshakable power. His eyes were like twin blades, piercing and unrelenting. When he looked at her, it was as though he had already read every page of her life, as if he knew her struggles, her fears, her desperate attempts to keep dignity intact. And perhaps he did, because men like him always knew everything. Her name was Lena, and she had lived her life clinging to scraps of hope. Each day was a battlefield, rushing from law school lectures to night shifts, juggling textbooks with trays of coffee, watching her mother wither under the weight of unpaid hospital bills. She had never asked for miracles. She had stopped believing in fairy tales long ago. But she never thought survival would demand this kind of sacrifice, that she would sign herself away to the one man who represented everything she despised. His name was Damien Wolfe, and his reputation was a weapon. They called him cold, calculating, untouchable. He moved through boardrooms like a storm, his voice a quiet command that made even the most arrogant executives tremble. Women wanted him. Men feared him. Newspapers speculated about his fortune, but even they underestimated the depth of his reach. He owned skyscrapers, technology firms, private jets, and a network of secrets that could crush anyone who stood in his path. And yet, none of those things were as dangerous as the darkness he carried inside him. The wound of betrayal that had carved ice into his veins. When Lena was ushered into his office that night, clutching a leather folder, she thought she was there for business. Just a delivery. Just another task her boss had forced on her because no one else was available. She had rehearsed her lines all the way through the marble hallways. Hand him the papers, get the signature, walk away. But fate never cared about plans. Fate delighted in tearing them apart. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind her, the air shifted. The space was vast, lined with windows that revealed the city lights burning against the dark sky. But it wasn't the skyline that stole her voice. It was him. Damien sat behind a sleek black desk, the faint glow of his laptop illuminating sharp features and eyes that seemed carved from steel. His suit clung perfectly to a body honed like a weapon, but it was not his wealth or his beauty that shook her. It was his stillness. He was the kind of man who didn't need to move to dominate a room. His presence alone commanded obedience. "You're not Sinclair," he said, his voice low, edged with a dangerous calm. Her throat tightened. "Mr. Sinclair had an emergency. He sent me instead." He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way a predator studies prey. "And you are?" "Lena Carter," she whispered. His eyes flickered, not with surprise, but with recognition, as though he had already memorized the name before she even spoke it. She set the contract on his desk, her palms damp, her breath shallow. But instead of signing, Damien closed the folder and laced his fingers together. "You're interesting," he murmured. The words made her pulse spike. She had heard rumors about this man, how he played with people like chess pieces, how no one ever knew what game he was truly playing. And in that moment, she understood that her life was about to be rewritten by forces she couldn't control. When he finally made his offer, the world tilted on its axis. 1 year, no love, no emotions, just an arrangement. She would be his companion, his shadow in public, his possession in private. In return, her debts would vanish, her mother's hospital bills would be paid, and she would never want for anything again. It was the kind of devil's bargain that left no room for pride. Her first instinct was to refuse. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear up the papers and tell him she would never belong to him. But when she thought of her mother's fragile body hooked to machines, when she remembered the eviction notices piling at the door, her defiance shattered. Survival demanded surrender, and Damien knew it. He always knew where to strike. She told herself it would be just business, that she could give away a year of her life and emerge untouched. But deep down, a voice whispered the truth. Nothing about this man was safe. Nothing about his world was survivable without scars. What she didn't know was that Damien had chosen her for reasons she couldn't begin to imagine. She thought she was a random girl plucked from obscurity, a convenient pawn in his cold games. But in his private files, her name was written long before she ever stepped into his office. Her bloodline carried shadows, her family carried secrets, and in ways she could not see, her destiny was already tangled with his enemies. The night she signed her name on his contract, she chained herself to a man haunted by betrayal, hunted by enemies, and driven by a need for revenge so deep it had poisoned his soul. She walked willingly into his penthouse, into his life, into his cage. And though she told herself it was only for survival, every step she took pulled her deeper into his orbit. The city outside glittered with wealth and lies, but within those glass walls something more dangerous than power was beginning to stir. She was supposed to be temporary, a transaction, nothing more. But when his hand brushed hers for the first time, when his voice softened for just a fraction of a second, the truth flickered between them like a forbidden flame. She had sold her innocence. He had bought her silence. But love, that reckless, merciless force, did not care about contracts or rules. It was already there, hidden in the tension of their gazes, in the sharp edges of their arguments, in the fragile spaces between words unspoken. And so the scandal began. A poor girl bound to a billionaire feared by all. A family enemy turned into her captor, a contract signed in desperation. But the truth behind the deal, why he chose her, why he could not let her go, was darker than she could ever imagine. Because in the end, this was not just about money or revenge or survival. It was about two broken souls colliding, shattering each other, and maybe, just maybe, finding salvation in the wreckage. And as the city slept, as cameras flashed in distant ballrooms and whispers spread through corridors of power, Lena Carter stepped into the most dangerous year of her life. The year she would belong to Damien Wolfe. The year that would strip her, break her, tempt her, and test her in ways she had never known. 1 year, one contract, one love that was never meant to exist. But the truth behind this arrangement, behind this scandal, behind this man, was much darker. Lena Carter had always known the world was divided by walls she could never cross. On one side, there were people who lived under chandeliers, who drank champagne as casually as water, who wore wealth like a second skin. On the other side, there were people like her, those who counted coins before taking the subway, who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, who prayed their mother's medical bills would not pile high enough to drown them. From the moment she was old enough to understand what debt meant, Lena had lived with a weight pressing on her chest. She grew up in a small apartment that smelled faintly of damp walls and old books. Her father had vanished when she was just a child, leaving behind promises that turned into nothing more than dust. Her mother, once radiant, spent her days working until her hands cracked and her back bent just to put food on the table. When illness finally claimed her strength, Lena found herself standing alone, shouldering the burden of both daughter and provider. Nights that should have been filled with laughter and friends were instead consumed by fluorescent lights in diners, endless hours balancing trays, rushing from class to work, from work to the hospital. Still, Lena was resilient. She told herself she could endure it. Law school was supposed to be her escape, her one chance to build a better future. She wanted justice. She wanted to fight for the forgotten, the weak, the invisible. But the system was cruel and justice was expensive. Each semester brought tuition fees she could barely cover, loans that wrapped tighter around her throat, and professors who demanded excellence, while the rest of the world demanded survival. By the time she entered Wolf Enterprises that night, she was a girl on the edge, pushed so far by circumstance that she no longer knew where desperation ended and surrender began. Her beauty was not the kind you saw in magazines. It was softer, quieter. Eyes too large for her thin face, hair pulled back in practical knots, clothes that spoke more of necessity than luxury. But there was something about her, something unyielding beneath the fragility, like a flame refusing to go out in the wind. That was what Damien Wolfe noticed first. Damien had been born on the opposite side of the wall, where opulence was the air itself. But even in his world of glass towers and private jets, his life had not been free of scars. He was a man shaped by betrayal, a man whose story was whispered with awe and fear across the city. His empire stretched from finance to technology to real estate. His name was inked in headlines, his deals studied like scripture in boardrooms. But behind the polished suits and ruthless victories was a past so broken it had calcified into armor. Years ago, when he was young enough to still believe in loyalty, he had let someone close. Her name was Celeste. To the world, she was perfection, elegant, ambitious, the perfect match for a man like him. They were supposed to be unstoppable together, an empire built not just on money, but on devotion. On the day of their wedding, with every camera pointed at them, with the world watching, she left. She didn't just leave. She walked away with his greatest rival, Victor Langston, a man who had haunted Damien's business for years. The humiliation was public, but the wound was private. It cut into the deepest part of him and never healed. And from that day, love became weakness, trust became a liability, emotions were nothing but distractions. He built his walls higher, colder, stronger. To outsiders, he was untouchable. To those who worked beneath him, he was a god they feared, a storm they endured. But alone, when the crowds were gone and the champagne glasses empty, he was a man haunted by silence. A man who looked at the city lights and saw nothing but reminders of what he had lost. He vowed never to be fooled again, never to let anyone close enough to destroy him a second time. That was the man Lena stumbled into. To her, Damien was the embodiment of everything wrong with the world. Wealth hoarded by the few, power used as a weapon, compassion traded for control. To him, Lena was supposed to be just another name on a contract, another transaction. But from the moment she opened her mouth and challenged him, this girl with no fortune, no pedigree, no protection, something inside him shifted. She was different. She was not impressed by his office, not dazzled by his suits. She looked at him like he was a man, not a god. She argued, she defied, and when she walked into his office, clutching that folder, he saw more than desperation. He saw fire. The terms he laid before her were cruelly simple. 1 year. No love, no emotions, no complications. She would be his companion in public, his presence at events, the face he chose to stand beside him. In return, he would wipe away her debts, pay her mother's hospital bills, and give her a life most could only dream of. To him, it was just business, another deal struck in a lifetime of deals. But to her, it was a lifeline disguised as chains. At first, Lena hated him for it. She hated the way he stared at her, as if he owned her before she even agreed. She hated the smug curve of his lips when he saw her hesitation. She hated the calm certainty with which he knew she would say yes. And yet, she did. Because what choice did she truly have? Pride could not cure her mother. Defiance could not pay rent. She signed her name, and in that moment her life was no longer her own. Damien escorted her into his world of glass and gold, a world so foreign it felt like stepping into a dream designed to suffocate. His penthouse towered above the city, with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting a life of power she could never belong to. His rules were absolute. No uninvited guests, no secrets, no speaking of the contract. Everything about him was order, control, perfection. But beneath it all was something else, an emptiness that mirrored her own. People whispered about Damien Wolf's cruelty, about the way he destroyed his rivals without blinking. But Lena saw the cracks. She saw the nights he drank alone, the scars he kept hidden beneath his shirts, the way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking. He was not just a man without love, he was a man terrified of it. Lena's family had warned her about men like him. Her mother had begged her never to get tangled in the world of billionaires, never to trust those who could buy and sell lives with a flick of their hand. But destiny didn't ask for permission. Destiny had already decided their paths would collide. Because Damien had secrets about her, too. Secrets he had uncovered long before she ever stepped into his office. Her bloodline, her past, her very existence was tied to the man who had once destroyed him. She thought she was just a poor girl drowning in debt. She didn't realize she was also a key to his vengeance. And so, their stories converged. The girl who had nothing but hope, and the man who had everything but peace. She became his contract, his possession, his companion. He became her salvation, her tormentor, her captor. Neither of them expected the fire that would burn between them. Neither of them expected the truth that would unravel the moment their worlds collided. Lena was stepping into his cage, but Damien did not realize he was stepping into hers as well. Two broken people, bound by desperation and betrayal, would soon discover that the line between love and destruction was thinner than either of them imagined. The night their contract began, a new story was written. A story of shadows and secrets, of wounds that never healed, of two hearts colliding against the walls they had built. She was the girl from the gutter. He was the man from the tower. And yet, in the silence between their battles, something neither of them believed in began to awaken. Not trust, not safety, not peace, but the dangerous, fragile whisper of love. The storm of fate gathered quietly, like a shadow before the lightning. For days, Lena had convinced herself that this arrangement was nothing more than survival, a transaction etched in ink, a temporary cage she could endure. But she had not yet faced the truth of what it meant to stand in his presence, to breathe the same air, to feel the weight of his gaze. The first real encounter between them, the moment when their lives stopped being parallel lines and collided head-on, was not scripted by contracts. It was raw, tense, and impossible to undo. It began on a winter evening when Damien summoned her. His driver collected her from the small apartment she still clung to, the place that smelled faintly of bleach and exhaustion. The car was sleek, black, silent as it cut through the city. Lena sat rigid in the back seat, her heart slamming against her ribs, her mind racing with all the reasons she should flee. But every time she imagined running, she saw her mother's fragile body, the unpaid hospital bills, the collection letters piling higher than her courage. And so she stayed. The elevator ride to his penthouse felt like an ascent into another universe. Each floor climbed further from the world she knew, until the doors opened with a soft chime and revealed a view that stole the breath from her lungs. Manhattan stretched in glittering lights, an ocean of glass and steel under the night sky. His home was not a home. It was a fortress. Marble floors, leather furniture, art pieces that cost more than her life, and silence so thick it pressed against her skin. And then he appeared. Damien Wolfe. Standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture carved from stone. He didn't turn immediately when she entered. He let her walk into the vast emptiness, let her footsteps echo, let her nerves coil tighter until she thought she might break. When he finally faced her, his eyes caught hers with such intensity she nearly forgot to breathe. "You're late," he said. The words were simple, but the tone was sharp enough to cut. "There was traffic," she managed. His lips curved slightly. Not a smile, but something colder. "In my world, excuses are meaningless." It was then she realized that nothing about this arrangement would be easy. He was not offering her charity. He was offering her chains. Dinner was waiting, though she had no appetite. The table stretched endlessly, yet he sat directly across from her, close enough that she could feel the gravity of him pulling her in. He asked nothing about her day, her life, her fears. Instead, his questions were sharp, designed to test, to probe, to see if she would flinch. How long had she worked at the law firm? How much debt did she owe? Did she understand what it meant to be bound to him for a year? Each answer she gave felt like stripping away another piece of herself. She wanted to scream that she was not a number, not a debt, not a pawn. But her pride was already bleeding, and his eyes saw too much. At one point, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping the marble floor. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to echo. "I'm not some thing you can just buy." Damien leaned back, unshaken. "No, you're not. But you agreed to be mine. There's a difference." The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, she hated him with a purity she had never known. Hated his calmness, his control, his ability to reduce her to a possession. But then, against her will, her eyes locked with his, and she felt it. The flicker. Something beneath the ice. Something dangerous. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. She told herself to look away, but her body betrayed her. Their gazes clung, unspoken words sparking in the silence between them. She saw the pain buried deep in his eyes, the wound that had never healed, and for a heartbeat she forgot her fear. She forgot the contract. She forgot the reasons she was supposed to keep her distance. "Sit down," he said softly, and she did. Not because of his authority, but because of the tremor in his voice. So faint, she wondered if she had imagined it. That night did not end with kisses or confessions. It ended with walls still standing, rules still intact. But something had shifted. The ice had cracked, even if just for a moment. The real collision came days later, when he took her to an event, a gala dripping with chandeliers and crystal, where the city's elite paraded in gowns and tuxedos, their laughter brittle, their smiles sharp. Lena had never felt more out of place. She wore a dress Damien's assistant had chosen, silk that clung to her like a secret she wasn't ready to tell. Cameras flashed as they entered, and she fought the urge to shrink. Damien's hand rested lightly on the small of her back. To outsiders, it was a gesture of possession. To her, it felt like a command. Stand tall. Survive this. She tried. She smiled when introduced, nodded politely, ignored the whispers that hissed like snakes around her. But then it happened. A woman approached, tall, blonde, with a smile too sharp to be kind. Celeste. The name Lena had heard only in fragments, in whispers. Damien's ghost. "Well," Celeste purred, her eyes sliding over Lena with disdain. "And who is this?" Before Lena could answer, Damien spoke, his voice cool and unyielding. "She's with me." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they sent a shiver down her spine, because they sounded less like protection and more like ownership. Celeste's smile widened. How interesting! The tension in that moment was unbearable. Lena wanted to flee, to tear herself from Damien's side, to vanish back into the shadows. But she didn't. She held Celeste's gaze, forcing her spine straight, her chin high. For the first time, she realized this was not just a deal. This was a war. And she was standing on a battlefield she didn't understand. Afterward, in the limousine, silence wrapped around them like a second skin. Lena stared out at the city, her heart pounding, her mind racing. "You hate her," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's jaw tightened. "She's irrelevant." But Lena knew better. No one leaves scars that deep and becomes irrelevant. The ride ended at the penthouse, and Lena thought she would escape to her room, lock the door, breathe. but Damien stopped her in the hallway, his hand closing gently but firmly around her wrist. She turned, startled, and found herself inches from him. For the first time, his mask slipped. His eyes were dark, conflicted, alive with something that terrified her more than anger, desire. Not just the physical kind, but the dangerous desire to feel, to trust, to break his own rules. "This isn't what you think," he said, his voice low, rougher than before. "Then what is it?" she asked. His silence was louder than any answer. He let her go, turned away, retreating into himself. But Lena felt the tremor in his grip long after he released her. That was the night she understood. Contracts could dictate terms, but they could not dictate hearts. She was not supposed to matter. He was not supposed to care. Yet the sparks between them had already been lit, and once fire begins, it cannot be contained. The fateful encounter was not a single moment. It was every glance that lingered too long, every silence charged with words unspoken, every clash that ended not in victory, but in the strange pull toward one another. She was supposed to be his pawn. He was supposed to be her captor. But the truth was far more dangerous. They were becoming each other's undoing. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they are buried. For Lena, the first cracks appeared not in the grand halls of Wolf Enterprises or the glittering galas where Damien paraded her like a queen, but in the quiet spaces, in the moments when she caught shadows where there should have been none. A closed drawer in his study, locked though it contained nothing she should need. Conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. The way his jaw tightened whenever the name Victor was mentioned, as though the syllables themselves were poison. She had told herself she could endure anything for a year. A contract, no matter how cold, was still a contract. But the truth arrived one evening in the form of a file left carelessly on Damien's desk. She hadn't been snooping, not really. She had been searching for a book in his study when her eyes caught the corner of a folder, her own name scrawled across the tab in bold letters. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. The file was not just a dossier, it was her life dissected. Every debt, every medical record, every address she had ever lived in, and at the bottom of the stack, a name she had not seen in years, Victor Langston. The letters blurred as her breath quickened. Victor. Her mother had warned her about him, had whispered about dangers tied to his name. Now she understood. Damien had not chosen her by chance. She was never a random girl trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was bait. A pawn in a revenge scheme far larger than she had imagined. The papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the polished floor like shards of truth. When the door opened and Damien stepped in, she was already trembling with rage. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" she demanded. His eyes flickered to the papers. For once, his mask faltered. "I see you've been digging." "Don't you dare act like this is nothing," she cried. "You orchestrated everything. From the moment I walked into your office, you were lying to me." Damien exhaled slowly, crossing the room with calculated calm. "I didn't lie. I simply didn't tell you everything." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "That's the same thing." He closed the distance until he stood a breath away. "You agreed to the contract, Lena. You knew this was never about love." Her chest tightened. "Maybe not. But it didn't give you the right to use me, to use my family, to use my life as a weapon against him." His gaze darkened, but beneath it there was something raw, something almost desperate. "Victor took everything from me," he said quietly, "and now I take from him." "And me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What happens to me?" For the first time, Damien hesitated. His lips parted, but no answer came. That silence was louder than any confession. She pushed past him, tears burning her eyes, hating herself for the way her heart still twisted toward him, even as he shattered her trust. But the universe wasn't done testing her. Days later, the ghost of his past returned in flesh and blood. Celeste Vaughan, the woman who had once promised to be his bride, who had walked away from the altar with Victor, appeared at the penthouse as if she owned it. She was elegance in crimson silk, her smile sharp enough to slice through bone. "Well, well," Celeste said, eyes sweeping over Lena with cruel amusement. "Congratulations are in order, I suppose." Lena stiffened, forcing herself to meet that icy gaze. "You must be Celeste." "And you," Celeste purred, "must be temporary." The words landed like a knife, but Lena refused to flinch. She stepped closer to Damien, pressing her palm against his chest, as if to remind them both of the lines drawn. "Funny," she said sweetly. "That's not what he told me last night." For a fraction of a second, Celeste's smile faltered. Damien's hand found Lena's waist, his grip firm, a silent warning, or maybe a reassurance. Lena leaned into it, though her heart hammered so violently she thought it might give her away. Celeste laughed softly. "Cute. But you and I both know this isn't real." Damien's voice was ice. "What do you want, Celeste?" Her eyes darkened. "I made a mistake." The shift in him was immediate. His jaw tightened, his body stilled, his mask cracked just enough to reveal the storm beneath. Lena's breath caught. He still felt something. Whether hate or longing, she could not tell. And that terrified her more than anything. When Celeste left, the silence she left behind was deafening. Lena wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg him to choose. But all she could do was stand there, aching, as Damien's gaze lingered too long on the door where Celeste had disappeared. The unraveling continued like a slow, merciless storm. The contract, their secret, was exposed. One morning, Lena woke to the blinding light of her phone screen, dozens of messages, headlines screaming across every site. Billionaire's fake marriage revealed. The terms of the deal, the money, the photographs of every public appearance, splashed across tabloids, dissected by strangers. She was painted as a gold digger, a woman who had sold herself for luxury, and Damien was branded a manipulator, a man who turned women into accessories. By the time she reached the street, the paparazzi were already waiting. Microphones shoved in her face, cameras flashing, voices screaming. "How much did he pay you? Did you marry him for money? Are you just his whore?" Each word cut deeper than the last. She stumbled back into the penthouse, rage and humiliation boiling inside her. "You told me no one would find out," she hissed. "You promised this would stay between us." "I didn't leak it," Damien said, his voice steady, too steady. "Then who did?" she demanded. His silence told her everything she needed to know. "Celeste." Her voice broke. "You still love her, don't you?" "Lena, don't!" she shouted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't you dare lie to me again. I was nothing to you. A game. A pawn in your war. That's all I ever was." His entire body went rigid. He wanted to deny it, but no words came, and that silence was her answer. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her cold. "It wasn't Celeste." Lena froze, her hand on the door. Slowly she turned back. "Then who?" Damien's eyes softened for the first time. Regret flickered in their depths. "Your sister, Angela." The floor seemed to collapse beneath her. Her own sister, blood betraying blood. Victor had bought her loyalty, sold their secrets, destroyed what little trust Lena had left in the world. She left that night, not running, but walking with a dignity that broke her heart. She left behind the penthouse, the luxury, the lies. She left behind Damien, who didn't stop her. That, more than anything, was what hurt the most. But fate is merciless. She didn't get far before Victor's shadow fell over her life again. A black SUV cut her off on a deserted street. Hands grabbed her, dragging her into the dark. The world went silent except for the pounding of her heart. When the hood was ripped from her head, she found herself bound in a warehouse, the stench of oil and rust suffocating her. And there he was, Victor, smiling like the devil who had finally won. "You see," Victor said, crouching before her, his fingers gripping her chin, "the best way to hurt my brother isn't through his empire. It's through you." Her blood turned to ice. And somewhere across the city, Damien felt it, the breaking point. The moment when the war was no longer about revenge or contracts or scars. It was about her. The woman he had sworn not to love, the woman he had reduced to a pawn, the woman who had become his undoing. When the call came, when he heard she had been taken, the last of his walls crumbled. His empire, his vengeance, his pride, none of it mattered any more. There was only Lena. And as the night deepened, as gunfire erupted and shadows clashed in the dark, Damien Wolfe finally became the thing he had sworn he would never be. A man willing to risk everything for love. The warehouse reeked of oil and blood, of rusted chains and forgotten screams. Lena's wrists burned as the ropes bit deeper into her skin, every breath shallow, every heartbeat echoing louder than the footsteps circling her. Victor stood in front of her like a king surveying his conquest, his smirk wide, his voice dripping with venom. "You were never more than a pawn," he murmured. "The perfect piece to lure my brother into the open. And now he'll come running. He always does." Fear churned in her stomach, but it was not for herself. It was for Damien. Because she knew him now, knew the man beneath the steel. He would come. No matter the cost, he would walk into this trap. And that was exactly what Victor wanted. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the groan of shifting metal beams and the occasional sound of Victor's men moving in the shadows. Lena's hope wavered, but then, faint at first, she heard it, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. Shouts rang out. Chaos flooded the warehouse. And through the smoke, through the storm of violence, he appeared. Damien Wolfe, the man who had built empires, who had sworn never to feel, who had reduced her life to ink and clauses, now stood with fire in his eyes and death in his hands. His men tore through the guards, each bullet a promise that no one would take her from him. Victor laughed, raising a knife to Lena's throat, pressing the cold steel against her skin. "Take one more step, and she dies," Victor hissed. Damien did not falter. His voice cut through the chaos, low and lethal. "Put it down." Victor's grin widened. "Or what?" The world narrowed to that moment. Lena's breath caught as she felt the blade press harder, a thin line of pain across her neck. Damien's hand tightened around the gun, his knuckles white. Then, without hesitation, he fired. The bullet tore through Victor's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. The knife clattered away. Damien was already moving, tearing through the ropes, pulling her into his arms as though nothing else existed. "I've got you," he whispered against her hair, his voice raw, his arms like steel. And in that moment, Lena realized something terrifying and beautiful. He had broken every rule, every vow, every wall he had ever built. Because of her. The night bled into dawn. Back at the penthouse, Lena sat wrapped in one of his shirts, her body trembling, her mind a storm of fear and relief. Damien hovered near, his usual calm stripped bare, his eyes shadowed with something she had never seen before, desperation. For hours, he didn't let go of her hand, didn't look away from her face. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Why did you come for me?" she whispered, her throat raw. "Because," he said, and then stopped. He swallowed hard, his gaze burning into hers. "Because I love you." The words fell between them like thunder. She blinked, stunned, her heart slamming against her chest. Damien Wolfe, the man who had sworn love was weakness, who had reduced her to a contract, was confessing the one truth he had fought hardest to deny. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice breaking. "For everything. For doubting you, for using you, for pushing you away. I almost lost you tonight, Lena. And I can't—" His voice fractured. "I won't survive it if I lose you again." Tears blurred her vision. She reached for him, her fingers trembling as they cupped his face. "You broke my heart," she whispered. His eyes shut, pain flickering across his features. "I know, and I'll spend every day of my life trying to make it whole again." She let out a shaky laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks. "That's not how it works." "Then tell me how," he pleaded softly. "Tell me how to fix it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then she said the words that had haunted her since the beginning. "I don't want to be a choice. I don't want to be something you regret later." His eyes snapped open, fierce and unyielding. "You're not a choice, Lena. You're the only choice." And then his lips were on hers, not in possession, not in control, but in surrender. A kiss of love, raw and reckless, breaking the last of the walls between them. For the first time, there was no contract, no vengeance, no mask. Just Damien and Lena, two broken souls finally colliding without fear. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Healing was not easy. Trust was not rebuilt overnight. There were fights, there were tears, there were nights when Lena still woke from nightmares of ropes and knives, but every time Damien was there. He stood by her through each storm, proving with every touch, every word, every sacrifice that his love was not another game. And then, one night, he stood before her, holding the very contract that had bound them together. The paper was worn now, creased from the hands that had held it too tightly. His voice was steady but low, stripped of all armor. "This," he said, "ruined everything. I thought it would protect me, that it would keep things in order. But all it did was push you away." Her breath hitched as he gripped the paper, his fingers trembling. "Now," he whispered, "I break the terms." And with a single motion, he tore the contract in half. The pieces fluttered to the floor like ashes, like the remains of a prison they no longer needed. Lena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. "This was never about a deal," Damien said, stepping closer. "Not for me, not anymore. You changed me, Lena. Every day you tore down my walls. You made me feel things I swore I never would. And I fought it because I thought love made me weak. But I was wrong. Not loving you is what made me weak." Her heart ached at his words, her chest heaving with emotion. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I don't care about the Empire. I don't care about revenge. None of it means anything without you." She shook her head, tears falling freely. "You can't just give up everything for me." "I already have," he said, his voice unbreakable. Her laughter broke through the tears, soft and broken and beautiful, and for the first time she let herself believe. 1 year later, the skyline of Manhattan burned with the glow of sunset as Lena walked through her gallery. Her gallery. The dream she had once buried under debt and despair was now alive, her art hanging on walls that carried her name. Each painting told a story, each brushstroke a piece of her journey from survival to freedom. She paused at one canvas, her fingers grazing the paint. It was a piece she had never shown anyone, a storm breaking into light, a reflection of her life, of her heart. "Do you like it?" a voice murmured behind her. She turned, her heart skipping as she saw him. Damien Wolfe, still powerful, still dangerous, but now hers. The walls were gone, the ice melted. He had traded vengeance for love, empire for home. "I love it," she whispered. And when he crossed the room, when his arms wrapped around her, she knew the truth she had once denied. The contract had ended, but their story had only just begun. Because when a billionaire finally surrenders, when love no longer obeys rules, when two broken souls find each other in the wreckage, there is no prison, there is no bargain, there is only freedom, there is only love.